Good morning. We're in the middle of a series you'll never hear God say, and we're talking about things that God will never say to you. The most important thing about us, it's not always clear or obvious to us. The most important thing is our deep thoughts about God. So here's the deal. What you believe about him, that's an important thing about you. Probably the most important thing about you and me is what we believe about him. Whether we're confident of his care, whether we believe him to be aware of us, responsive. You know that? That really matters to you, whether you know it or not. How much you believe that God is aware of your situation, how responsive he is to you, that matters to you. We're not always aware of how much it matters, but it does. Whether your thoughts generate security or insecurity. Some of us, when we think of God, we don't feel very good. I remember I was in college, and I really didn't read the Bible much growing up. The church I went to, somebody else read the Bible, but I never read it, so I never really thought much about it. And then when I started reading it, some of the stuff made me nervous. There was this Psalm 139 that says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go here, you're there. If I go here, you're there." And what I felt is, I didn't like that. You know I was supposed to love God, but I didn't like him because he made me nervous. The fact that he was with me and he was with me wherever I went, I didn't like that. You know what I prayed once? I remember praying this and learning to be honest with God. We'll read something a little bit later about being honest with him. I say, you know what, God? At one time in my life, I want to read those words and I want to feel good about it. I want to feel warm. I don't want to feel freaked out. There's three aspects of spiritual life that we tend to look at: thoughts, attitudes, and actions. And here's what thoughts are: our opinions about God. Sometimes we don't say them out loud. Thoughts are our opinions about God, our thoughts about God. Is he aware? Is he responsive? Then attitudes are our responses to his will based on our thoughts about him. And then actions are the result of thoughts and attitudes. For instance, if you think that God waits to get you in a position where he can get stuff from you, that God's pretty grabby, pretty insensitive, just pretty much into it for himself. If that's our thought, what's going to be our attitude when we hear him tell us to do something? I don't think so. I don't think so. So that's our attitude because it's based on our thought, right? You try to get blood from a rock. You get stuff that you can't really expect to get, and therefore I'm going to resist your will. So what's my action going to be? I don't know. But I'm not going to love him, and that's the kind of action that he wants. So that's the deal, isn't it? Thoughts, attitudes, and actions. You know where it all begins? Over there. Thoughts. We're looking today at, let me look at the verse. You know what we tend to do? Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. You know what we tend to scrutinize? Let me ask you. Thoughts, attitudes, and actions. What do we tend to feel most guilty about? Thoughts? Attitudes? What do you think? We tend to feel most guilty about actions, don't we? You know why? Because that's what everybody looks at. You know what God looks at? He doesn't look at actions. Well, he looks at them, but that's not what he judges. What does it say he judges? The heart. You know what's in the heart? Thoughts and attitudes. This is the realm of the heart, right here, this place. And this is what God looks at. That's why we're looking at thoughts about God today. God will never tell you, I don't care. You can't say it. We'll deal with why we feel far from God. Look what it says. In your worship folder, there's a sheet, some verses on it. We're going to read it through and talk about them. It says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in your faith. It says, cast all your anxiety on him. You know what anxiety literally means? It's a divided mind. That's what the word is. It's a compound word in the original language, one word for divided, one word for thought. So anxiety is a divided mind. Do you know what anxiety looks like? If you think of the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. Which way? Well, that was a good way to go. You did one of these things. Well, that's a good way, and that's what a divided mind is. We want to be in two places at the same time. I want to be here and I want to be there. I want to do this and I want to do that. I want you to do this and I want you to do that. We can't really land on something. That's what anxiety is like. Divided thoughts. Remember Mary and Martha? It's a story in the Bible. Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, but Jesus was very open to instructing women, and that wasn't very common in those days. Martha was caught in between. So she was in the kitchen, and she wanted to be with Jesus. And you know why she was anxious? Because she wanted to be in two places at the same time. They need a meal, so I want to be in the kitchen, but I want to be able to hear what Jesus is saying, so I want to be at his feet. And that image of her being in two places at once, but not being able to be in two places at once, that's anxiety. Divided thoughts. What's the root of anxiety? Let me ask you. What do you think's at the root of anxiety? Actions? Attitudes? Thoughts? I say it's thoughts. Look what it says. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. That word enemy, there's a couple kinds of enemies in the Bible. One of them is a hostile enemy. It's one who's going to kill you, beat you, if you let him. That's not the kind of enemy it's talking about. There's a kind of enemy in the Bible that's your enemy in a court. And if you're there making a statement saying, yeah, I think I did okay, this word for enemy used of the devil is an opponent in a court of law. So I'm saying, I did this, I did that, and it was okay. And this is the enemy. The devil is, no, that's not it at all. Your Honor, he didn't do what he said he'd do. He did that. He didn't do this. And that's when it says your adversary, your enemy, the devil, it's speaking of the kind of enemy that shows up in a court of law. That's what kind of influence Satan has. In fact, the word Satan means accuser. Accuser. To Satanize someone is to judge them. No, that was wrong. That's what Satan means. The word devil means divider. If I was to take something in this group here, say if I were to take a firecracker, M80, throw it in the middle, and what would happen if I threw it right in the middle, you guys would go this way. And you know what I just did? I just deviled you. I deviled you. I created a split between a group of people. So that's what Satan means, one who accuses in order to split, in order to divide, in order to make one group two by saying, I saw, and so you split from each other. That's what it means. That's what Satan does. He's an accuser and a divider. And I think this is where anxiety comes from. When it says cast all your anxiety on him, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Do you know where anxiety comes from? Having an opponent in a court of law that's going to judge you and divide you. Do you hear what she said? Do you hear what he said? You're not good. He's not. That's what he does. That's how Satan divides. There's a couple things. I had a good conversation yesterday with a friend who was reading in some place about fear and how fear is the opposite of faith. You know what fear is? And he was right when he said, can we really control fear? We really can't. You know what fear is? The natural response to a perceived threat. That's what fear is. Is it possible for you not to be afraid? Is it possible for you to cancel out fear in your life? Absolutely not. I was in the old resource center once, down on Western Avenue. There was a light shining in through the window. I was walking, I had turned the lights off, there was a light in the window, it was evening. And it caught my shadow, it caught me and projected a shadow And I immediately, my blood ran cold until I figured out it was me that I was looking at, which is scary enough. But I didn't even have a chance to think. It was I don't think it's possible. You can't get rid of fear. You can respond to it. Do you know the difference between fear and anxiety? All of us are going to be afraid. Fear is facing a threat. Anxiety is facing it alone. Anxiety is facing it alone. Fear is a natural response to a perceived threat. Anxiety is the natural response to facing it alone. Do you know why Satan accuses and divides? Because when you're alone, it's easier to pick you off. Do you know the way lions work? What lions do, they'll run at a group. They'll run at this group, and you know what they'll do? They'll get you so that you're taking off in all different kinds of directions. Now, if I do this to you, and I'm a lion, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pick somebody off who falls or is weak or is weary. And the reason that I'm going to be able to be successful is I run at you and I create division. And that's what Satan does. He runs around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour, runs at groups, tries to divide them. And because you're easier to pick off. And now I can't jump up. I'm going to have to walk all the way around the thing, and here we go. Because if I try to jump up on that thing and something happens bad, no, I don't think so. Okay. I wonder if that was worth it to go. That's okay. Fear is facing a perceived threat, and anxiety is about facing it alone. Why do we feel far from God? There's a couple of verses from Job. Look at this. You know what's interesting? Remember what happened to Job. All his life fell apart. And so all these things, physical and his family and his business, everything's getting trashed. And then he has these three counselors that come by. Eliphaz is the one who starts off, and here's what happened to Eliphaz. He was the one who spoke first. So imagine you're sitting there, and all these nasty things have happened. Eliphaz is a spiritual man. And here's what happened to Eliphaz. It was nighttime. And a spirit glided by his face. It made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was scary. And this is what the Spirit said. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at three passages, one from Job chapter 4, one from Job chapter 15, and one from Job chapter 25. Here's your assignment. I'm going to read these accounts. He says it the first time. Now, I want you to see what happens when he says it the second time. And then his friend says it the third time. See if you can find what happens to this account. Okay? You got my drift? You understand what I'm saying? See if you can find a progression here. Okay, here's the first one, Job chapter 4. And here's what the Spirit says to Eliphaz. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? If God places no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who live in houses of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, who are crushed more readily than a moth? Between dawn and dusk they are broken to pieces. Unnoticed they perish forever. Are not the cords of their tent pulled up so that they die without wisdom? Well, thank you so much for those encouraging words. I really, your Job, boy, thanks so much for that. And then 10 chapters later, look what we find. See if you can find a progression. What is man that he could be pure, or one born of woman that he could be righteous? If God places no trust in his holy ones, if even the heavens are not pure in his eyes, how much less man who is vile and corrupt, who drinks up evil like water? You sensing something happening here? Catch the third one. This is his friend now, who's heard him speak. What does he do with what he's heard? How then can a man be righteous before God? How can one born of woman be pure? If even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes, how much less man who is but a maggot a son of man who was only a worm. What's the progression? Man starts off as a worm, and what does he become? A maggot. God becomes one who doesn't place trust in his holy ones, gets to the place where even the heavens aren't pure in God's eyes. Nothing's pure in God's eyes. You know what's happening here? With each successive iteration, God becomes more distant, doesn't he? More impossible to please. Distance. Distance. Question. Ready? Was that spirit from God? Sure? Does God say you're a maggot? Does God say, I'm impossible to please? I'm an impossible to please perfectionist? Because some of you think that the Spirit is from God. That's the way you think about God. I used to think that way. Is that really what God is like? What do you think? I see a lot of you shaking your head. This isn't God. It's not him. You know what happens? Distance increases and judgment increases. Here's the way you know whether something's from God or not. If judgment increases and distance increases, you're not walking towards God, you're walking away from him. The more you know about God, the less you fear judgment and the closer you come. That's the way it is. And we're going to see it in another passage. You know what ends up happening to Job? They come and they want to sanitize him. You know what they want to cleanse him. These bad things are happening, so they want to sanitize him. You know what they did? They didn't sanitize him. You know what they did? They Satanized him. They Satanized him, not sanitized him. Distance, accusation. Satan is an accuser, and he creates distance. They Satanized him. They bedeviled him. This isn't God. Who speaks for God? I'm going to say something. We say it. You know what? Secular people aren't the problem. Sacred people are. Eliphaz claimed to speak for God. That's what made him powerful. And you know what he did? He misrepresented God. That's the problem. You know what I'd say? I think it can be. Now, I'm not going to blow up a publication, but I think Christianity today can be far more dangerous than psychology today. Psychology today doesn't claim to speak for God. Christianity today does. And sometimes they misspeak, create distance where there is one. Now, I'm not blowing up the publication. You're saying, have I read every? No, I don't read a lot of Christianity today. But I know that there's individuals who claim to represent God but misrepresent him. So that's the thing that we need to be wary of. Because spiritual, well, it's about thoughts. And you know what you need to do in order to develop, to live here? You need to have a good yes and a good no. Say yes to the things that are true and say no to the things that aren't. If somebody increases judgment and distance, you know what you do? Okay, you don't have to scream at the person, but just know in your head, no, that's not him. That's not him. You're intimating that there's all this distance, that he's impossible. No. Develop a good yes and a good no. You have to. We need to point the no at those who claim to speak for God, but whose influence is Satanizing rather than sanitizing. How can we feel close to God? How can we feel close to God? Again, the spirit that confronted Eliphaz and Job increased distance. Now, what we're going to find, this passage is going to talk about Jesus. Now, here's what I want. I'm going to read it. You tell me if distance is increasing or it's decreasing. You got me? The person, do you feel pushed away from God, or do you feel pulled towards God? How many of you felt pushed away from God with, God's holy and you're not, and you're a moth or you're a maggot? Does that make you feel far from God? Yeah? Absolutely it does. See if this makes you feel far from God. Look what it says. Hebrews 4, the word of God is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Look at this. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Do you feel pushed away from God here? Do you feel pushed away? How many of you feel pulled close? I sympathize. Come to the throne of grace, receive mercy, and find grace to help. You know what this is? This is God. This is God. God doesn't distance, he draws. Satan distances, God draws. That's the difference. A couple things here. How to feel close to God. Start with, I'm going to give you 4 things to remember. I'm going to talk about what he knows, who he is, how he feels, what he wants. Some of you are going to be thinking, you're going to be in a place where you're going to say, I feel far from God. And you know what I'm going to ask you to do? I'm going to ask you to remember 4 things. What he knows, who he is, how he feels, what he wants. Can you remember those 4 things? The first one, what is it? What he, and then who he is, and then how he feels, and then what he wants. Think about it. Close your eyes. Try to remember the first. What he knows. Second, who he is. Third, how he feels. Fourth, what he wants. Let's look at him. Fill in the blanks. What he knows, who he is, how he feels, what he wants. What he knows, who he is, how he feels, what he wants. He knows everything. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. You know why it doesn't make sense to pretend with God? Because he already knows. Do you really need to hide from God because you have thoughts that he doesn't like? Really? Let's talk. He already sees them. Where are you going to hide? You can't see me. You can, no, you can't. Your kids ever do that? You can't see me. So that's what we do with God. So we have all these thoughts, and then we talk to him. God, thank you so much for life. I just love life. Now, you can't see all the questions inside me because I'm hiding them. And we sense that doesn't make much sense, does it? God, I feel beat up. You know that? I don't feel real good about where I am. You know what God would say to that? Oh, that's it. That cuts it. No. Finally, you're being honest. If you're going to talk, let's be real. I already see what's real. So why are you pretending? You know what I mean? Doesn't make sense, does it? He knows everything. What does he know? What does he know? Tell me, what does he know? He knows everything. And if he knows everything, it doesn't make sense to pretend. Right? Who is he? He's my high priest. You know what a high priest is good at? Dealing with sinners. That's what he's a professional at, dealing with sinners. If you're not a sinner, you have no business with a high priest. If you're a sinner, you need a high priest. How many of you need a high priest? Eric, you need a high priest. Get your hand. We all need a high priest. And you know what? Jesus is great at it. He's a great high priest. When you understand who he is, you don't need to be afraid to come to him, but you don't know what I did. He does. And he's the one you need to go to. No, I need to clean up my life before I get to Jesus. No, you don't. You don't need to clean up your life before you get to him. He's the one that cleans it up. He's a high priest. That's what he does. And when you understand who he is, you don't need to be afraid to come to him as you are. What does he know? What does he know? And that's why you don't need to pretend. Who is he? Who is he? And therefore, if you understand who he is, you don't need to be afraid of him. This is the one that I love. Jeez. You know what? I don't know a person. If I was to pick one quality of a person with whom I want to be, it would be sympathy. Not judged. Sympathy is, I understand. Tell me. We don't have a high priest who is able to sympathize. How does Jesus feel? Tell me. He sympathizes with you. That means he understands. He understands. And when you understand that he sympathizes, you don't need to be. Do you know what the universal facial gesture for shame is? Universal facial gesture for shame. I was in China. They did the same thing. In fact, they had a word for it. Here's what shame looks like. Tell me what I'm doing. This is shame. You know what I'm doing? I don't want you to see my face. In fact, in China, you know what they call that? Losing face. Losing face. If you say something to someone that makes them do this, you've made them lose face. You don't do that in China. He sympathizes with our weakness. And because he sympathizes with our weakness, we don't need to be ashamed. What does he know? What does he know? He knows everything. Who is he? How does he feel? He sympathizes with you. He knows everything. He's the person that you come to when you're a sinner, and he sympathizes. Is this different from the spirit that approached Job? Is it different? Is this the true God? This one, the one who sympathizes? The one who says, I know? The one who says, we have a great high priest? Which one of these is the real God? This one is. This is him. Jesus reveals him as this. What does he want? What does he want? You know what confidence is? Come to the throne of grace with confidence. Confidence means speak freely. You know what he wants you to do? Unbutton your mouth. Talk to him. What does he know? Who is he? How does he feel? If you remember what he knows, and if you remember who he is, and remembers how he feels, you know what you're going to do? Finally, somebody I can talk to about everything. And that's what he wants from you. He wants you to speak freely with him. Freely. Exhale your concerns to him. Inhale his commitments to you. 40 days with the 10 commitments. I'm not doing a sales thing here. I was just talking to Eric before, and it's talking to many of you, and it's just a book you go through that helps you know what God's thinking about you. It gets at thoughts. Pick a book up. If you have $5, throw it in. If you don't, don't. But now I got to get up. There we go. That was more graceful than that would have been. He wants you to speak freely with him. That's what he wants. And he doesn't just suggest it. He commands it. That's what he says. Approach the throne of grace with confidence. This isn't a suggestion. I think it's time we started being honest to God. Stop playing games. Use pattern prayers, but don't let them be a substitute for what's really going on. Be respectful, but be real. It's a relationship. Have a relationship with God, not a fake one. Have something real. You know what I mean? Tell him, you know what, God? That was a turning point in my Christian life. I don't like you. Put the lightning rod up just in case. No, I didn't get zapped. I said, I already knew that, Mike. You know what? Now, 30-some years later, I read Psalm 139. No joke. It took a long time. I breathe. I like the fact that he's around. You know what's happening? And it took a long time. You hang out. It's getting to the place where I like him. I never thought it. And it comes from understanding his commitments. Say no to the type of influence that pushes you away. Say yes to the type of influence that pulls you close. Worship team's going to come up. We're going to sing a song. I'm going to read through an article out of Base for Grace. We did some books that talk about the message of grace in Hebrews, Galatians, and Romans. This is from the one on Hebrews, Base for Grace. We're just going to read it through, and then we're going to close with a song. The Base for Grace, we say, and it's in your worship folder if you want to follow along. We say right things to God, not real things. Why is it so hard for us to be honest with God? For the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give accounts. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, speaking freely, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray. That would be us. We are the ignorant and going astray part. His is the ability to be gentle. That's a nice combination. Huh? Since he himself is subject to weakness, God tells us that we may approach the throne of grace with confidence. Confidence means the ability to speak freely with someone in our dealings with him. In our dealings with him, God gives us freedom of speech. He encourages us to enter his presence and speak openly with him without fearing his censure or reprisal. Speaking freely with God does not come naturally to us. We hold back from speaking openly with him for the same reasons we don't speak freely with one another: pretense, fear, and shame. Pretense causes us to be selective in what we say to someone else. We share only those things that will elicit the desired reaction. Pretense also causes us to be selective in our dealings with God. We tell him what we think he wants to hear. Since nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight, it doesn't make sense to pretend with God. He judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. He sees beneath the surface of our actions. He knows what we are thinking and feeling. We can't hide anything from him. God knows everything. We don't need to pretend with him. Fear keeps us from speaking freely because of the consequences of admitting the truth. We hold back from saying everything in order to protect ourselves. Fear also causes us to shrink away from telling God about our true feelings and struggles. We imagine that what we tell him will anger him. God is safe to talk to. He sent his son, Jesus Christ, to be our great high priest because we all struggle with sin. A high priest is an expert at helping people who wrestle with sinful thoughts, attitudes, and actions. Because Jesus is our high priest, he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray. Jesus is our high priest. We don't need to be afraid of God. Shame causes us to conceal the truth from others. We have a hard time being honest when we are embarrassed by what we've thought, said, or done. Shame also causes us to hold back from telling God everything. We imagine that what we tell him will disappoint or disgust him. Because Jesus sympathizes with our weaknesses, we can speak freely with God. Someone who sympathizes with us is easy to talk to. God sympathizes with us. He doesn't make us feel defective when we're honest with him. There's no need to hide anything from him. God sympathizes with us. We don't need to be ashamed to be honest with him. Do you feel distant from God? Is it hard for you to speak openly with him? Remember, God knows everything. You don't need to pretend. Jesus is your high priest. You don't need to be afraid. God sympathizes with you. You don't have to be ashamed. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Approach God's throne. Speak freely with him. God wants you to receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. I'm just going to guide you to think about a few things. You can maintain an attitude of prayer. I'm not going to go on long. I want you to remember 4 things, though. When you're talking with God, remember what he knows. Remember who he is. Remember how he feels. Remember what he wants. You think you could do that? What he knows everything. Who he is, he's a great high priest. How he feels, he sympathizes with your weaknesses. What he wants you to speak freely with him. God, would you help us to do that? We all get these thoughts about you, and all of us are a collection of things we've heard, and some are true and some are not. Somebody claimed to be speaking on behalf of God, and it was more like the spirit that approached Job. Distance, fear. That's not what you tell us. Not through Jesus. You talk about sympathy. You talk about come close. You talk about I know everything. I guess what I'm asking, this is not a one-stop thing, but would you help us to continue to see you and think about you as you really are, so that what we think about you might deal with the pretense, fear, and shame, and we might find ourselves closing the distance, not increasing it. We find ourselves speaking freely with you, not pretending. Pray that you'd help us to understand who you are. Help us to love you and love others. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, again, if you want to hang around for that meeting, right back there, glad you came.